Prince Harry has spent his entire life trying to prove he understands struggle. The interviews, the memoirs, the public confessions about mental health and feeling trapped by royal protocol. He's positioned himself as the rebel prince, the one who escaped the palace, the one who finally gets what normal people go through. Until May 2024, when he sat across from Conor McGregor at a private charity dinner in Monaco and tried to bond over their shared understanding of hardship. What Conor said in response, gentle but devastating, changed the entire room. And when Harry's reply came 15 minutes later, it revealed something nobody expected. A genuine willingness to listen, to learn, to admit that maybe, just maybe, he didn't understand as much as he thought he did. This is the story of two men from impossibly different worlds who found common ground in the most unexpected way, through brutal honesty. To understand why this conversation mattered so deeply, you need to know three things. First, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, fifth in line to the British throne, has spent the years since leaving royal duties in 2020 on a very public journey of self-discovery. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the memoir Spare that became the fastest-selling non-fiction book in history. His entire brand has become authenticity, vulnerability, speaking truth to power. He's portrayed himself as someone who finally understands what real life is like outside palace walls. Second, Conor McGregor comes from Crumlin, one of Dublin's working-class neighbourhoods. At 23, he was on welfare, living with his parents, training in a freezing gym with coaches who couldn't pay rent. Everything he built came from nothing, from hunger, from a desperation to escape poverty that Harry, despite his struggles, has never known. Third, in May 2024, they were both invited to a private charity gala in Monaco, an event for mental health awareness that brought together athletes, celebrities, and royalty. The organizers seated them at the same table, thinking their shared interest in mental health advocacy would make for easy conversation. They had no idea what they were about to witness. The Hôtel de Paris Monte Carlo is one of the most exclusive venues in the world. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, staff trained to be invisible. The charity dinner was held in a private ballroom, limited to 50 guests, all high-net-worth individuals committed to mental health causes. The dress code was black tie. Conor arrived wearing a custom-made tuxedo in midnight blue, his wife Dee by his side. Harry arrived with Meghan, both looking relaxed, comfortable in these elite settings, despite their public narrative of escaping them. The seating was intimate, round tables of 6. Conor and Harry were seated next to each other, with Meghan on Harry's other side, Dee next to Conor, and 2 mental health advocates filling out the table. The first hour was pleasant, safe conversation. They discussed the charity, the importance of mental health awareness, the stigma around seeking help. Harry spoke passionately about his own therapy journey, about the trauma of losing his mother, about feeling trapped in a system that wouldn't let him be himself. Conor listened, nodded, asked thoughtful questions. He shared his own experiences with anxiety before fights, with the pressure of expectation, with learning to separate Conor McGregor the persona from Conor the person. The table was engaged, the conversation flowing naturally. And then, about 90 minutes into the dinner, Harry said something that changed the entire dynamic.
"You know, Conor," Harry said, leaning slightly toward him, his tone warm and genuine, "I really relate to what you're saying about pressure and expectation. I think we have more in common than people might realize. We've both had to perform, to be someone the public expects us to be, even when it doesn't match who we really are. We've both struggled with that disconnect." The table nodded along. It seemed like a reasonable observation. Two public figures finding common ground. Conor took a sip of his whiskey, placed the glass down carefully, and looked at Harry for a long moment. His expression was thoughtful, not hostile, but something in his eyes suggested he was weighing his next words very carefully. "With respect, Your Highness," he said quietly, his Dublin accent soft but clear, "I don't think we've struggled with the same things." Harry's eyebrows raised slightly. He smiled, but there was a hint of defensiveness there. "Well, I mean, obviously our circumstances are different, but the emotional experience." Conor raised his hand gently, interrupting politely. "Let me explain what I mean," he said, "and I'm saying this with genuine respect because I think you're doing important work with mental health awareness. But there's a difference between struggling within a system and struggling to survive outside of one." The table went quiet. Megan's expression shifted, watchful now. Dee placed her hand on Conor's arm, not restraining, just supporting. Harry leaned back slightly, arms crossed, listening but guarded. "Go on," he said. "When you talk about feeling trapped in the royal family," Conor began, his voice measured and calm, "I believe you felt that genuinely. I believe the protocols, the expectations, the lack of privacy, all of that was real and difficult. But you were trapped in a palace, Harry, with security, with healthcare, with education, with every material need met. When I felt trapped at 23, I was trapped in poverty, and there's a difference." Harry's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "The difference," Conor continued, "is that your struggle was about freedom and identity. My struggle was about survival. When you had a bad day, you could talk to therapists, take time off, go on holiday to process things. When I had a bad day, I had to choose between eating or paying for gym fees. When you felt pressure to perform your royal duties, the consequence of not doing it was public criticism. When I felt pressure to perform in the gym, the consequence of not doing it was staying poor forever." He paused, making sure his tone stayed respectful. "I'm not saying your pain isn't real. Mental and emotional suffering is real, regardless of your bank account. But when you say we've both struggled with the disconnect between who we are and who we're expected to be, you're talking about identity. I was talking about survival. Those aren't the same conversation." The room was completely still. One of the mental health advocates at the table looked like they wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Megan's expression was unreadable, and Harry, to his credit, didn't get defensive. He just sat there, processing, his face cycling through several emotions.
Conor wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his tone remaining gentle, but his words carrying undeniable weight. "You wrote in your book about feeling like a spare, about being the backup, about not having a clear role, and I understand that must have been painful. But Harry, I was also a spare. I was spare labour, spare potential, another kid from Crumlin who might make it, probably won't, and if he doesn't, nobody will notice or care. The thing is," Conor continued, "when you decided you'd had enough of royal life, you could leave. You moved to California, to a mansion, with security, with your family intact, with opportunities waiting. You could choose your exit. When I decided I'd had enough of poverty, I couldn't just leave. There was no mansion waiting. There was no safety net. There was just me, a gym, and the absolute certainty that if I failed, I'd be back on welfare with no second chance." Harry was listening intently now, his defensiveness fading, replaced by something that looked like genuine curiosity. "So when you talk about understanding struggle," Conor said, and again I say this with respect, you understand a very specific type of struggle. You understand the struggle of being seen but not heard, of being valuable but not valued in the way you wanted, of having purpose but not the one you chose. Those are real struggles, but they're not the same as wondering if you'll eat today. They're not the same as training with broken equipment because you can't afford new gear.
They're not the same as watching your parents work themselves to exhaustion and knowing you can't help them unless you somehow become something they can't even imagine. He paused. Let that sink in. You've struggled within abundance. I've struggled within scarcity. Both are hard, Harry, but they're different kinds of hard, and I think it's important to acknowledge that difference. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Harry sat completely still, his hands folded on the table, his expression serious. The mental health advocates were watching him carefully, perhaps expecting him to get defensive, to argue, to protect his narrative. Megan's hand moved toward Harry's arm, a gesture of support or perhaps warning, but Harry didn't take it. Instead, he took a deep breath and did something that surprised everyone at that table. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly. Those words hung in the air. The table seemed to collectively hold its breath. "I've never," Harry continued, struggling slightly with the words, "I've never had to worry about money, not really. I've complained about being cut off financially by my family, but that was about control, not about survival. I've never wondered where my next meal would come from. I've never had to choose between healthcare and rent. He paused, searching for words. "I've been protected from that kind of fear my entire life." Conor nodded but didn't speak, letting Harry continue. "And I think," Harry said, his voice stronger now, "I think I've been conflating emotional struggle with material struggle. And you're right to point out that they're not the same thing. I can talk about feeling trapped, but I was never trapped in poverty. I was trapped in privilege. And that sounds absurd when I say it out loud, but it's true." The honesty in the room was palpable. This wasn't performative vulnerability, the kind Harry had been criticized for in his media appearances. This felt real, raw. "I think," Harry continued, "I've spent so much time trying to prove that my pain was valid, that my struggles were real, that I've sometimes lost sight of the fact that pain and privilege can coexist. And that doesn't make the pain less real, but it does mean I need to be more careful about how I talk about it, especially when I'm sitting across from someone who's actually lived the kind of struggle I've only read about."
Conor's expression softened. "Harry, with respect, your pain is valid. I'm not trying to diminish it. I just think precision in language matters. When you say, 'we all struggle,' people hear that as 'we all struggle equally.' And we don't. That's not an attack on you, it's just reality." Harry nodded. "I understand, and I appreciate you being honest with me instead of just nodding along because of who I am. Most people don't challenge me on this stuff. They either worship me or hate me, but very few people actually talk to me." Conor smiled slightly. "Well, I don't worship anybody, and I don't hate people for being born into circumstances they didn't choose, but I do value honesty. And honestly, I think you have an important platform, but the way you use it matters. If you talk about struggle without acknowledging the difference between types of struggle, you risk alienating the people who are actually in survival mode." Harry leaned forward, genuinely engaged now. "So how should I talk about it? How do I acknowledge my own difficulties without sounding like I'm comparing myself to people who've had it so much harder?" Conor thought for a moment. "You could say something like, 'I've struggled with identity and purpose within a system of privilege. That's real, but it's not the same as struggling for basic needs. Both matter, but they require different conversations.' Something like that. Make the distinction clear." Harry pulled out his phone, actually typed something into his notes. Megan watched him, a slight smile on her face. "Can I quote you on that?" Harry asked, looking up. Conor laughed. "You're the prince, Harry. You don't need my permission. But yeah, if it helps, use whatever I said. Just, maybe don't make me sound smarter than I am." The table laughed, the tension breaking completely. What had started as a potential confrontation had become something else entirely, a genuine conversation between two people willing to be honest with each other. The dinner continued for another 2 hours, but the dynamic had completely changed.
Harry asked Conor specific questions about his upbringing, about what poverty actually looked like day to day, about the psychological impact of growing up knowing you were one missed opportunity away from permanent struggle. Conor answered honestly, not sugarcoating but also not dramatizing. He told stories about his father working 3 jobs, about his mother stretching meals to feed 4 people, about the shame he felt accepting welfare checks while his friends had normal jobs. He talked about the desperation that drove him, the fear that if he didn't make it as a fighter, he'd end up like so many others from his neighborhood, talented but forgotten. Harry listened without interrupting, without trying to relate everything back to his own experience, just absorbing information about a world he'd never inhabited. At one point, Conor said something that seemed to hit Harry particularly hard. "The thing about real poverty," Conor said, "is that it's not just about lacking money, it's about lacking options. When you're born into wealth, even if you're struggling emotionally, you have options. Therapy, travel, career changes, geographic moves. You can try different things until you find what works. When you're born into poverty, you get 1 shot, maybe 2 if you're lucky, and if you miss, there's no reset button. That's what makes it so terrifying. You're not just fighting to succeed, you're fighting to escape, and the stakes are your entire life." Harry sat back, clearly processing. "I've never thought about it that way," he said quietly, "about options as the real privilege. I've always had the option to fail and try again. Most people don't have that." "Exactly," Conor said, "and I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. You didn't choose to be born royal any more than I chose to be working class. But it's important to understand that difference when you're trying to connect with people about struggle, because for a lot of people, struggle isn't a journey of self-discovery, it's just survival, and those 2 things feel very different."
As the dinner wound down, something unexpected happened. Harry asked Conor for his phone number. Not through assistants, not through managers, but directly. "I'd like to continue this conversation," Harry said, "if you're open to it. I think I have a lot to learn from your perspective." Conor nodded. "Sure, but only if you're actually interested in learning, not just collecting stories for your next interview. I don't do performative friendships." Harry laughed, genuine and warm. "Fair. No, I mean it. This conversation has been more valuable than a year of therapy sessions because you're not trying to make me feel better. You're trying to make me understand better. That's rare." They exchanged numbers. Megan and Dee, who had been having their own quieter conversation throughout the evening, also connected. As they prepared to leave, Harry did something that those present said they'd never seen him do at a public event. He asked if he could take a photo with Conor, not for social media, just for himself, to remember this conversation. Conor agreed. The photo, which Harry never posted, but which was seen by a few people close to him, shows 2 men standing side by side, no forced smiles, just genuine respect. According to people close to both men, they did stay in touch, not frequently, but occasionally. Harry would text Conor questions about perspective, about how to talk about certain issues without sounding tone-deaf. Conor would respond, sometimes with long, thoughtful messages, sometimes with just a few words of advice. 3 months after the Monaco dinner, Harry gave an interview where he was asked about privilege and struggle. His answer was markedly different from previous responses. "I'm learning," he said, "to be more precise about my experiences. I've struggled, yes, but I've struggled within a context of immense privilege, and that's different from people who struggle without any safety net at all. Both experiences are valid, but they're not equivalent, and I'm trying to be more mindful of not conflating them." The interviewer asked where that shift in perspective came from. "A conversation with someone who wasn't afraid to tell me the truth," Harry said simply. "Someone who challenged me in a way that was respectful but firm. It made me realize I had blind spots I wasn't aware of."
What happened in Monaco that evening wasn't about one man humbling another. It wasn't about Conor putting Harry in his place or Harry having an epiphany that solved all his awareness problems. It was about two people from radically different worlds having an honest conversation without the usual filters that protect powerful people from uncomfortable truths. Conor didn't treat Harry with kid gloves because of his title. He treated him with respect, but also with honesty. And Harry, to his enormous credit, didn't respond with defensiveness or dismissal. He listened, he absorbed, he acknowledged, he grew. In the months that followed, people close to Harry noticed changes in how he spoke about his experiences. He became more careful with language, more willing to acknowledge his privilege, even while discussing his pain, more thoughtful about whose stories he was centering when he spoke about struggle. It wasn't a complete transformation. Change is gradual, but it was noticeable. And it came from that one evening in Monaco when a prince and a fighter sat across from each other and decided that honesty mattered more than comfort. The lesson wasn't that Harry's struggles don't matter. They do. Mental health, identity, purpose, these things matter regardless of your bank balance. But the lesson was about precision, about understanding that struggle is not a monolith, that different people face different challenges, and that acknowledging those differences doesn't diminish anyone's pain. It just makes the conversation more honest. And sometimes, honesty is the greatest gift one person can give another. Not agreement, not validation, but truth, delivered with respect, but without compromise. That's what Conor gave Harry that night, and what Harry gave back was something equally rare in powerful people: the willingness to listen, to really listen, not to respond, not to defend, but to understand. In a world where everyone wants to be heard, that might be the most radical act of all. What you just witnessed was more than a conversation between a prince and a fighter. It was a masterclass in how to challenge someone's perspective without destroying their dignity, and how to receive criticism without collapsing into defensiveness. If this story made you think differently about privilege, about struggle, about the importance of precise language when discussing pain, then share it, because the world needs more conversations like this, real ones, uncomfortable ones, honest ones. Subscribe for more stories that show you the moments when people choose growth over ego. And remember, the strongest thing you can say isn't "I understand your struggle." Sometimes it's "I don't understand your struggle, but I'm willing to learn."